Money doesn't just open doors in this city, it owns them. For 3 decades, Alexander Caldwell turned justice into a marketplace where innocence was worthless and guilt was just a number on a check. His signature graced the bottom of every dirty deal. His influence corrupted every institution, and his name became a whispered warning in the halls of power. They said crossing him was like crossing fate itself, inevitable destruction wrapped in designer suits and offshore accounts. But fate never met Judge Anthony Carter. They call him the last honest man in a bought system, the judge who can't be threatened, bribed, or broken. The son of Chicago's unforgiving streets who rose to become corruption's worst nightmare. In 30 years on the bench, he's never compromised, never looked away, and never forgotten what justice costs when you refuse to sell it. Now, as Carter's gavel cuts through the manufactured silence of courtroom 237, 2 immovable forces are about to collide. Caldwell believes his money can drown any truth. Carter knows some truths can't be drowned. They can only be delayed, and justice has waited long enough. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of courtroom 237, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge Anthony Carter stood before his mirror in his chambers, adjusting his black robes with practiced precision. His dark fingers smoothed down the fabric as his mind wandered to the challenging day ahead. After 20 years on the bench, he'd earned his reputation for unwavering integrity, but cases like today's always tested the limits of justice. Your Honor? His clerk, Sarah Mitchell, knocked softly. They're ready for you. Anthony nodded, taking one final look in the mirror. The face that gazed back at him showed the weathered determination of a man who'd fought his way up from nothing. Growing up in Southside Chicago, he'd watched his mother work 3 jobs to put him through law school. Every sacrifice, every obstacle overcome, had led to this moment. Another day in pursuit of justice, he murmured, following Sarah into the corridor. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Today's case had drawn national attention. Alexander Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, faced charges of tax fraud, embezzlement, and offshore money laundering. The scale of his alleged crimes was staggering, with millions siphoned from pension, funds, and community development projects. Assistant District Attorney Elena Cruz sat at the prosecution table, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She'd spent months building this case, knowing the deck was stacked against her. Caldwell's crimes had devastated vulnerable communities, leaving retired teachers and factory workers struggling to make ends meet while he lived in luxury. The defense table sat conspicuously empty. Judge Carter checked his watch. 9:15. Caldwell was already 15 minutes late. At 9:27, the courtroom doors burst open. Alexander Caldwell strolled in, phone pressed to his ear, designer suit perfectly tailored to his tall frame. His silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his tanned face bore the smug expression of a man accustomed to buying his way out of trouble. Yes, buy the shares now, he spoke into his phone, ignoring the bailiff's disapproving look. I don't care about the market predictions, just do it. All rise for the Honorable Judge Anthony Carter, the bailiff announced. The entire courtroom stood, except Caldwell, who continued his phone conversation while lounging in his chair. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Even Caldwell's attorney, Victoria Holt, looked uncomfortable, tugging at her client's sleeve. Judge Carter's face remained impassive as he took his seat. His voice, when it came, carried the quiet authority of a man who'd faced far worse than entitled billionaires. Mr. Caldwell, he said, his tone measured. In this courtroom, we observe certain protocols. One of those is standing when the judge enters. Another is refraining from phone calls during proceedings. Caldwell finally ended his call but remained seated, fixing Carter with a look of thinly veiled disdain. My apologies, Your Honor, he drawled, making the title sound like an insult. I was handling some rather important business matters. More important than showing respect for this court? Well, Caldwell smirked. That depends on one's perspective, doesn't it? The gallery fell silent. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding Caldwell's gaze. Let me adjust your perspective, Mr. Caldwell. You're facing federal charges that could put you away for 30 years. Your business matters can wait. Stand up. For a long moment, Caldwell didn't move. The tension in the courtroom grew thick, enough to cut with a knife. Finally, with deliberate slowness, he rose to his feet. Thank you, Carter said. You may be seated. Now, let's proceed with the arraignment. As Elena Cruz began presenting the charges, a court officer quietly approached. The bench slipping Judge Carter a folded note. He read it discreetly. Watch your back. Caldwell owns half the police department. Evidence has a way of disappearing in his cases. Carter's expression didn't change as he tucked the note into his robes. He'd suspected as much. Detective James Whitman, the police chief handling evidence in this case, had a reputation for being susceptible to persuasion. But suspicions weren't proof, and Carter knew he'd need to proceed carefully. The morning proceeded with a series of legal motions. Victoria Holt, streamlined in an expensive charcoal suit, argued skillfully for dismissal based on procedural grounds. Cruz countered with passionate precision, laying out the devastating impact of Caldwell's schemes on local communities. During a brief recess, Carter watched through his chamber windows as reporters swarmed Caldwell on the courthouse steps. The businessman played to the cameras with practiced ease. This is a witch hunt, Caldwell declared, flashing his perfect white teeth. Judge Carter clearly has an agenda. I've faced tougher judges than him, and I'm still here. The truth will prevail. Several news channels were already running segments debating judicial bias. Some pundits praised Carter's restraint in handling Caldwell's disrespect, while others questioned whether a judge from his background could be truly impartial in a case involving a wealthy white defendant. Back in chambers, Elena Cruz knocked on Carter's door, her face drawn with worry. Your Honor, do you have a moment? He gestured for her to enter. What's troubling you, counselor? Our key witness, the whistleblower from Caldwell's accounting department. She closed the door behind her. They're getting cold feet. Someone's been following them, taking photos of their kids at school. The police say there's nothing they can do. Carter's jaw tightened. Of course they do. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Ms. Cruz, this case will test everything we believe about justice. Caldwell doesn't just break laws. He thinks they don't apply to him. People like that are dangerous precisely because they believe their money puts them above the system. How do we fight that? Elena asked, frustration evident in her voice. One step at a time, Carter replied. Build your case methodically. Document everything. Trust no one outside your immediate team. And remember, men like Caldwell often plant the seeds of their own destruction through their arrogance. As Elena left, Carter found himself reflecting on his own journey to the bench. He remembered his first case as a public defender, representing a young black man falsely accused of robbery. The evidence proving his innocence had mysteriously vanished from the police station. That case had taught him hard lessons about justice and power, lessons that would serve him well now. The afternoon session brought more of Caldwell's subtle defiance. He answered questions with barely concealed contempt, his responses dripping with condescension. Yet Carter noticed something beneath the arrogant exterior, flickers of unease. When certain documents were mentioned, slight tensions in his jaw when specific dates came up. At day's end, Caldwell sauntered out of the courtroom, pausing at the door. Don't worry too much about this case, Judge, he called back. I'm sure we can come to an understanding. The implied threat hung in the air as Carter gathered his papers. He thought of the note in his robe, of Elena's worried face, of all the lives ruined by Caldwell's greed. The path ahead would be treacherous, but Carter had spent his life preparing for cases like this. Later that night, in his modest home study, Carter reviewed the day's transcripts. His wife, Michelle, brought him a cup of tea, her presence a quiet comfort. Tough case? She asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd been by his side through countless battles, from his days as a struggling law student to his appointment to the bench. Caldwell thinks he's above the law, Carter replied, sipping his tea. He's used to buying his way out of trouble, manipulating the system. The way he looked at me today, like I was beneath him, like my position meant nothing. Michelle squeezed his shoulder. Then show him what real justice looks like. Carter covered her hand with his, drawing strength from her support. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he allowed himself to remember why he'd become a judge in the first place. Not for power or prestige, but to ensure that justice truly was blind. Blind to wealth, to influence, and yes, to race. Night deepened outside his window as Carter continued working, preparing for the battles ahead. In his mind, he could already see the forces aligning against him: Caldwell's money, corrupt police, manipulated media. But he'd faced impossible odds before and prevailed. This case would be his biggest test yet, but Anthony Carter had never been one to back down from a fight. As he finally headed to bed, he thought of all the people counting on him to stand firm. The victims of Caldwell's schemes, the honest officers fighting corruption, the community that saw him as a symbol of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Judge Carter slept soundly, secure in his purpose. The law was on his side, and in his courtroom at least, justice would prevail. Early morning sunlight spilled through the windows of Judge Carter's chambers as he reviewed the previous day's events. Caldwell's blatant disrespect had set the tone for what promised to be a grueling trial. His contemplation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Victoria Holt strode into his chambers, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Her reputation preceded her, a brilliant legal mind who'd never lost a high-profile case, mainly because she excelled at finding loopholes rather than proving innocence. Your Honor, I've filed several motions regarding evidence admissibility, she announced, placing a thick stack of papers on his desk. We have serious concerns about the chain of custody for key documents. Carter picked up the first motion, scanning its contents. Ms. Holt, you're challenging the admissibility of virtually every piece of evidence the prosecution has gathered. With good reason, she replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. We believe proper procedures weren't followed. Detective Whitman's department has already acknowledged mishandling several key items. As if on cue, Elena Cruz burst into the chambers, her face flushed with anger. Your Honor, the whistleblower's testimony, all of it, has vanished from the evidence locker. Detective Whitman claims it was an administrative error, but this is the third piece of evidence that's mysteriously disappeared this week. Victoria's smile widened. Sounds like the prosecution needs to keep better track of their materials. Judge Carter held up his hand, silencing both women. Ms. Holt, I'll review your motions. Ms. Cruz, document the missing evidence and file a formal complaint. That's all for now. After they left, Carter sat back in his chair, connecting the dots. The anonymous note had warned him about evidence disappearing. Now it was happening, and Detective Whitman's fingerprints were all over it. Across town, in Caldwell's palatial mansion, a different scene was unfolding. Alexander Caldwell lounged by his infinity pool, sipping expensive scotch while Detective James Whitman paced nervously on the marble tiles. Relax, James, Caldwell drawled. Everything's going according to plan. The evidence is gone, and that self-righteous judge can't do anything about it. Whitman wiped sweat from his forehead. It's not that simple, Alex. Carter's not like the others. He's asking questions, demanding documentation. My guys are getting nervous. That's why I pay you so well, Caldwell replied, reaching for a manila envelope stuffed with cash. Another 100,000 to keep your department cooperative. And James? Make sure our friend from accounting doesn't make it to the witness stand. Neither man noticed the discreet security camera capturing their interaction, its red light blinking silently in the shadow of a palm tree. Back in the courtroom, the power struggle intensified. Victoria Holt filed motion after motion, each designed to stall proceedings and wear down the prosecution. Judge Carter maintained his composure, methodically addressing each challenge while keeping the trial moving forward. Caldwell's behavior grew increasingly provocative. He arrived late each day, barely acknowledging the court's authority. During testimony, He made a show of checking his phone or whispering loudly to his attorneys. Each small act of defiance tested Carter's patience, but the judge refused to take the bait. "Mr. Caldwell," Carter finally addressed him during an afternoon session, "your continuous disregard for court procedures is noting. Should this behavior continue, you will be held in contempt." Caldwell looked up from his phone, smirking. "My apologies, Your Honor. Sometimes I forget who's supposed to be in charge here." The gallery tensed at the implied insult, but Carter simply continued with proceedings, his dignity intact. That evening, Elena Cruz waited in a dimly lit parking garage, checking her watch nervously. Her star witness, Thomas Bradford, had agreed to meet her secretly after receiving threats at his home. As footsteps echoed through the concrete structure, she turned to see Bradford approaching, his face pale with fear. "They were at my daughter's school today," he whispered, hands shaking. "Two officers just watching. They didn't do anything, just watched. My wife wants me to drop out of the case." Elena's heart sank. Bradford's testimony about Caldwell's offshore accounts was crucial to their case. "Thomas, we can protect you. The FBI has a witness protection program." "The FBI?" He laughed bitterly. "Caldwell has people everywhere. I'm sorry, Elena. I can't risk my family." He turned and hurried away, leaving Elena alone with her crumbling case. Meanwhile, Judge Carter worked late in his chambers, reviewing case law for precedents that might help him navigate the challenges ahead. A soft knock interrupted his research. "Come in," he called, expecting his clerk. Instead, a young police officer entered, carefully closing the door behind him. "Judge Carter, I'm Officer Michael Sullivan. I need to tell you something about Detective Whitman and Mr. Caldwell." Carter leaned forward, interest piqued. "Go on." "Last week, I was assigned to the evidence room. I saw Detective Whitman remove files from the Caldwell case. He didn't follow protocols, didn't sign anything out. When I questioned it, he said it was special handling. I reported it to Internal Affairs, but nothing happened." "Why are you telling me this, Officer Sullivan?" "Because my father was a judge," Sullivan replied. "He taught me that justice matters more than politics. I can't prove anything, but I thought you should know." After Sullivan left, Carter found another anonymous note on his desk. "Check the offshore accounts. The truth is in the numbers." The next morning, Victoria Holt launched her most aggressive attack yet, filing a motion to suppress all evidence related to Caldwell's financial records. "Your Honor," she argued, "the prosecution obtained these records through questionable means. Their warrant was overly broad, and the search exceeded its authorized scope." Elena Cruz shot to her feet. "That's absurd. The warrant was properly executed, and everything was documented. At least it was before evidence started mysteriously disappearing." "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making unfounded accusations." "Enough," Carter's voice cut through the argument. "Ms. Holt, your motion is denied. The warrant was valid, and the evidence was properly obtained. Ms. Cruz, unless you have proof of evidence tampering, keep such allegations out of my courtroom." During the lunch recess, Caldwell appeared on a local news program, playing the victim card skillfully. "This trial is a travesty," he declared. "Judge Carter clearly has a personal agenda. How can anyone expect fairness from a judge who seems more interested in social justice than actual justice?" The interview sparked heated debates about judicial bias and race, exactly as Caldwell had intended. Some commentators defended Carter's integrity, while others questioned whether he could be impartial given his background. That afternoon, Elena Cruz made a breakthrough. A junior accountant from Caldwell Enterprises came forward with documents showing suspicious transfers to offshore accounts. But before she could secure the evidence, the accountant was arrested by Whitman's officers on dubious drug charges. "This is getting out of hand," Elena told Judge Carter after hours. "Every time we make progress, the police intervene. It's like fighting a ghost. We can't prove they're working for Caldwell, but everyone knows it's true." Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Keep building your case, Ms. Cruz. Document everything. Sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when we least expect it." As if proving his point, a new piece of evidence emerged that evening. A thumb drive appeared in Carter's chambers, containing photos of Detective Whitman accepting envelopes from Caldwell at various locations. The source was unclear, but the implications were impossible to ignore. Across town, Caldwell hosted a lavish party at his mansion, celebrating what he believed was his imminent victory. The city's elite mingled around his pool, sipping champagne and discussing the trial as if it were merely an inconvenient business matter. Anthony Carter is about to learn a harsh lesson about how things really work in this city, Caldwell told his guests, raising his glass in a mock toast. By the time this trial ends, he'll wish he'd never heard my name. But Caldwell's confidence was premature. In a quiet corner of the city, Officer Sullivan met secretly with FBI agents, sharing what he knew about the police department's corruption. And in her office, Elena Cruz discovered a pattern in Caldwell's financial records that would prove crucial in the days ahead. The next morning, Judge Carter arrived at the courthouse early, preparing for another day of legal battles. As he reviewed the mysterious thumb drive's contents, he reflected on the forces aligned against him. Caldwell's money, the corrupt police, the manipulated media, all working to obstruct justice. But Carter had faced impossible odds before. Growing up in Chicago's South Side, fighting his way through law school, battling systemic racism throughout his career, each challenge had prepared him for this moment. A noise in the corridor caught his attention. Through his partially open door, he glimpsed Detective Whitman having an intense conversation with Victoria Holt. Their whispered words were inaudible, but their furtive glances told their own story. Carter smiled slightly, remembering something. His mother used to say, "The truth is like water, it always finds a way to flow." Caldwell's empire of corruption was beginning to show cracks, and water was seeping through. As the courtroom filled for another day of proceedings, Carter noticed something different in Elena Cruz's demeanor. She carried herself with renewed confidence, organizing her papers with purpose. She caught his eye briefly, giving him a subtle nod that suggested she'd found something significant. Caldwell arrived right on time for once, but his usual smugness seemed forced. Victoria Holt whispered urgently in his ear as he took his seat, his face darkening at whatever news she shared. Carter called the court to order, ready for the next round in this high-stakes battle for justice. The power struggle was far from over, but the tide was beginning to turn. Sometimes, he reflected, the biggest victories come not from dramatic confrontations, but from the patient accumulation of truth. As he prepared to begin the day's proceedings, Carter thought of Officer Sullivan's courage, of Elena Cruz's determination, of all the honest people fighting against corruption in their own ways. They were all part of a larger struggle, not just for justice in this case, but for the very soul of the justice system itself. The morning sun streamed through the courtroom windows, illuminating the scales of justice mounted on the wall behind Carter's bench. In their perfect balance, he saw a reminder of what they were all fighting for, a system where truth mattered more than money, where justice prevailed over power. Looking at Caldwell's arrogant face, Carter allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The businessman thought he had all the power, but he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the strength of those who fought for justice not out of greed or ambition, but out of genuine conviction. The battle was far from over, but as Carter called the court to order, he knew that truth and justice would prevail. It was only a matter of time. The tension in courtroom 237 had reached a fever pitch by the third week of trial. Recent revelations about police corruption and evidence tampering had created an atmosphere thick with anticipation. Judge Carter's steady gaze swept across the gallery as Margaret Wilson, Caldwell's former accountant, took the stand. Margaret sat rigidly in the witness box, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Despite the threats she'd received, despite the patrol car that had followed her children to school yesterday, she'd chosen to testify. 20 years of watching Caldwell destroy lives had finally overcome her fear. "Ms. Wilson," Elena Cruz began, "how long did you work as head accountant for Caldwell Enterprises?" 17 years, Margaret answered, her voice growing stronger. "I oversaw all financial operations, including Mr. Caldwell's personal accounts. And during that time, what irregularities did you observe? Victoria Holt shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation. Overruled, Carter replied calmly. The witness's direct observations are relevant. Continue, Ms. Wilson. Margaret took a deep breath. It started with small discrepancies. Money moving between accounts in ways that didn't make sense. Then I discovered the offshore accounts, dozens of them hidden under shell companies. Mr. Caldwell was siphoning money from pension funds, community development projects, even children's charities. Caldwell's facade of indifference cracked slightly. His jaw tightened as Margaret detailed the elaborate network of fraudulent transactions he'd orchestrated. Elena methodically led her through years of financial records, painting a damning picture of systematic theft and corruption. The worst part, Margaret continued, her voice trembling, was seeing where the money was supposed to go. Senior centers that had to close, affordable housing projects that were never built, scholarship funds that vanished. Mr. Caldwell would laugh about it during board meetings, calling it creative accounting. As Margaret spoke, Detective Whitman slipped into the courtroom, taking a seat near the back. His presence wasn't lost on Judge Carter, who noted the subtle exchange of glances between the police chief and Caldwell. That evening, Margaret returned home to find her house in chaos. Her front door hung off its hinges, furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. Her hands shook as she called Elena Cruz. They took everything, she whispered into the phone. All my backup documents, my computer, even my children's laptops. The police say it was probably random burglars, but... Stay where you are, Elena instructed. I'm calling the FBI. Across town, Detective Whitman sat in Caldwell's study, sharing a glass of expensive bourbon. It's handled, he reported. Wilson won't have any evidence to back up her claims now. Caldwell swirled his drink thoughtfully. Good, but she's still a problem. People might believe her even without proof. Make sure she understands the consequences of continued cooperation with the prosecution. Already taken care of. My guys will drive by her kids' school again tomorrow. Maybe follow them. To soccer practice. Neither man noticed the silent figure in the darkened hallway, recording their conversation on a phone. The next morning, Elena Cruz confronted Whitman in the courthouse corridor. You're not even trying to hide it anymore, are you? She demanded. Breaking into a witness's home, threatening children? Is there any line you won't cross? Whitman smiled coldly. Careful, counselor. Making accusations against law enforcement is a serious matter. Besides, I heard Ms. Wilson's neighborhood has had several break-ins lately. Maybe she should invest in better security. Judge Carter watched this exchange from his chamber doorway, his expression grave. The corruption was becoming more brazen, but he needed hard evidence to act. The anonymous notes and surveillance photos helped paint the picture, but they weren't enough for court. As Carter reviewed the day's motions, his clerk announced an unexpected visitor. She says her name is Claire Caldwell, Your Honor. Alexander Caldwell's sister. The woman who entered his chambers carried herself with the same confidence as her brother, but there was a different quality to it. Less arrogance, more determination. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders or the shadows under her eyes. Judge Carter, she began without preamble. I'm the one who's been sending you the notes and photos. I have something you need to see. She placed a laptop on his desk, playing a video of Caldwell and Whitman's conversation from the previous night. The quality was perfect, the audio crystal clear. Carter watched in silence as Caldwell explicitly ordered the intimidation of Margaret. Wilson. Why are you doing this? Carter asked when the video ended. Why turn against your own brother? Claire's laugh held no humor. Because Alexander stopped being my brother long ago. He became something else. Something cruel and corrupt. I watched him destroy lives, break laws, hurt people, all while believing his money made him untouchable. She pulled out a flash drive. This contains years of evidence, recordings, documents, photos. I've been gathering it since he forced our father out of the company, drove him to... She paused, composing herself. Let's just say I have my reasons. Ms. Caldwell, Carter said carefully, if this evidence was obtained illegally, Everything was recorded on my property, or in spaces where I had legal right to be. I've had lawyers verify it's all admissible. I'm tired of watching Alexander hurt people, Judge Carter. It's time someone stood up to him. When Claire's evidence was introduced in court the next day, the reaction was immediate. Victoria Holt launched into a passionate argument about family vendettas and illegal surveillance. Caldwell himself lost his careful composure, shouting that his sister was a vindictive liar who'd always been jealous of his success. "Order!" Carter's voice cut through the chaos. "Ms. Holt, the evidence was legally obtained. Mr. Caldwell, control yourself or be held in contempt." Elena Cruz methodically presented Claire's evidence, starting with the video of Caldwell ordering Wilson's intimidation. The courtroom fell silent as his true nature was laid bare. The casual cruelty, the absolute belief in his own impunity. "He thinks he's above the law," Claire testified later that afternoon. "He told me once that justice is just another commodity to be bought and sold. The only difference between him and common criminals," he said, "was that he could afford a better class of crime." As Claire spoke, Carter noticed Caldwell writing something on a legal pad. He passed it to Victoria Holt, who read it with a frown before requesting a brief recess. Carter granted it, watching as Caldwell's legal team huddled in urgent conference. When they returned, Victoria Holt's strategy shifted dramatically. Instead of attacking Claire's credibility, she began laying groundwork for what appeared to be an insanity defense. She questioned Claire about their family history, their father's death, suggesting that Caldwell's behavior stemmed from deep-seated psychological trauma. "Objection," Elena Cruz interrupted. "Counsel is testifying. These questions about Mr. Caldwell's childhood have no bearing on the financial crimes he's charged with." "Sustained," Carter ruled. "Ms. Holt, stick to relevant lines of questioning." The afternoon brought another surprise. A janitor from Caldwell Enterprises, David Martinez, came forward with additional evidence. He'd been cleaning Caldwell's office late one night when he discovered documents detailing payoffs to police officers, judges, and city officials. But before Martinez could testify, he was arrested on supposedly outstanding warrants. Elena Cruz rushed to the police station, only to find him already being processed by officers under Whitman's command. "This is ridiculous," she protested. "These warrants suddenly appear the day he's supposed to testify?" Whitman shrugged. "Law's the law, counselor. Mr. Martinez should have taken care of his legal troubles before volunteering to be a witness. The message was clear. Caldwell's influence reached far and deep. Anyone who challenged him would face consequences." Back. In the courtroom, Claire's testimony continued to unravel her brother's carefully constructed facade. She described how he'd systematically corrupted police officers, starting with small favors and graduating to outright bribes. How he'd used blackmail and threats to silence opponents. How he'd laughed about owning half the city's officials. "The Alexander you see in court," she told the riveted gallery, "with his expensive suits and polite smiles, that's not real. The real Alexander is the one who bankrupted our father's oldest friend because the man refused to sell his company. The one who celebrated when he heard that witness against him had died in a random mugging." Caldwell's mask slipped further with each revelation. His habitual smirk transformed into a scowl. His confident posture became rigid with fury. When Claire described his reaction to their father's death, he finally exploded. "You treacherous bitch!" he shouted, rising from his seat. "You think you can turn my own family against me? I made this family what it is. I built an empire while you played at being Daddy's perfect little girl." "Mr. Caldwell." Carter's voice cracked like thunder. "One more outburst and you'll be removed from this courtroom. Is that clear?" The gallery buzzed with shocked whispers. This was the real Alexander Caldwell, not the smooth businessman who'd entered court 3 weeks ago, but a man accustomed to absolute power, enraged at being challenged. Elena Cruz seized the moment, producing records that corroborated Claire's testimony. Bank statements showing payments to police officers, emails discussing witness intimidation, security footage of meetings with corrupt officials. "The prosecution calls Detective James Whitman," Elena announced. Whitman took the stand, outwardly calm, but with a telling sheen of sweat on his forehead. As Elena questioned him about his relationship with Caldwell, his answers became increasingly evasive. "Detective Whitman," Elena pressed, "how do you explain the regular deposits of $50,000 to your Cayman Islands account?" "I don't know anything about that account," Whitman replied stiffly. Elena produced bank records. These deposits coincide exactly with key evidence disappearing from police custody in Caldwell-related cases. Just a coincidence? Before Whitman could respond, his phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it surreptitiously, but Judge Carter caught the movement. "Detective Whitman," Carter said firmly, "surrender your phone to the bailiff." The message from Caldwell was damning. "Keep your mouth shut. I'll handle everything." As the day's session ended, Carter knew they'd reached a turning point. Caldwell's true nature had been exposed, but like a cornered animal, that made him more dangerous than ever. In his chambers that evening, Carter reviewed Claire's evidence while Elena Cruz updated him on David Martinez's situation. They were interrupted by another anonymous note, this one containing a single line. "Watch the recording." Claire had mentioned one final piece of evidence, something so damaging that even she was afraid to reveal it. Whatever it was, Carter suspected it would shatter Caldwell's empire once and for all. As night fell over the city, different players in this drama prepared for what was to come. Claire Caldwell sat in a safe house, guarded by FBI agents, reviewing years of accumulated evidence. Elena Cruz worked late into the night, building an airtight case around the new revelations. Detective Whitman paced his office, wondering if it was time to save himself by turning on his benefactor. And Alexander Caldwell stood at his mansion's window, watching storm clouds gather over the city he'd once thought he owned. His perfectly manicured hand clenched around a glass of scotch as he made a phone call, one that would set in motion events that would shock even those who thought they'd seen his darkest side. The stage was set for an explosive confrontation, but as Judge Carter had learned over his years on the bench, the most dangerous moment in any battle for justice was when victory seemed closest at hand. The morning dawned gray and restless, matching the atmosphere in courtroom 237. Claire Caldwell sat at the prosecution table beside Elena Cruz, her posture rigid with determination. The gallery whispered in anticipation. Everyone had heard rumors about the recording she planned to play today. Alexander Caldwell entered with his typical arrogance, but those who looked closely could see cracks in his facade. His silk tie was slightly askew, his eyes carried the shadow of sleepless nights. Victoria Holt followed, clutching a stack of motions meant to prevent Claire's evidence from being heard. "Your Honor," Victoria began as soon as Judge Carter took his seat, "we move to suppress any recordings Ms. Caldwell plans to present. They were obtained through duplicitous means and represent a clear violation of Mr. Caldwell's privacy rights." "Elena," Cruz rose to counter. "Ms. Caldwell recorded these conversations in common areas of their family estate, where she maintained partial ownership. The recordings are perfectly legal and highly relevant to establishing Mr. Caldwell's pattern of criminal behavior." Judge Carter studied both attorneys before speaking. "Ms. Holt, your motion is denied. The recordings were legally obtained in areas where Ms. Caldwell had standing right of access. We will proceed." Claire approached the witness stand, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She carried a small laptop, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak. "This recording was taken 3 months ago in our family estate's library. Alexander was meeting with Detective Whitman and several other officers about handling potential witnesses in this case. The video began playing through the courtroom's audio system. The image showed Caldwell's library, all dark wood and leather-bound books. Caldwell sat behind an antique desk, Detective Whitman and 3 other officers standing before him, like servants receiving orders. "I don't care what it takes." Caldwell's voice rang clear through the speakers. "Nobody testifies against me. Use whatever means necessary. Intimidation, arrest, accident if you have to. I'm paying you enough to handle this." One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, some of what you're suggesting is exactly why I own half the department," Caldwell cut him off. "Don't develop a conscience now, Officer Roberts. Remember who paid for your mother's cancer treatments." The courtroom remained deathly quiet as the recording continued. Caldwell. Detailed plans to suppress evidence, intimidate witnesses, and obstruct justice. He named judges he'd bribed, officials he'd bought, rivals he'd destroyed. Each word further eroded his carefully constructed image of respectability. Then came the moment that changed everything. On the recording, Caldwell received a phone call. His face darkened as he listened, then exploded in rage. "What do you mean Johnson won't back down? He's just a worthless janitor." "Fine. If he wants to play hero, make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Just like we did with that nosy reporter last year." Victoria Holt's face went pale. The robbery of investigative reporter Michael Foster had been headline news, a supposedly random act of violence that had left him in a coma. Now Caldwell had just confessed to orchestrating it. "Your Honor," Victoria stammered, "we request a brief recess to confer with our client." "Denied," Carter replied firmly. "The recording will continue." As the video played on, Caldwell's expression transformed. From shock to fury to something approaching fear, he watched his sister reveal the evidence she'd spent years gathering, proving not just financial crimes but a pattern of violence and corruption that spanned decades. Elena Cruz methodically entered each piece of evidence into the record: bank statements showing payments to corrupt officers, emails discussing witness intimidation, surveillance photos of meetings with officials who had mysteriously changed their votes on regulatory matters affecting Caldwell Enterprises. "Ms. Caldwell," Elena asked, "why did you wait so long to come forward with this evidence?" Claire's eyes met her brother's across the courtroom. "Because I needed to be certain. Each time I thought I had enough proof, I discovered something worse. Alexander didn't just break laws, he believed they didn't apply to him. He saw himself as above the entire system of justice." Throughout her testimony, more revelations emerged. Caldwell had engineered the bankruptcy of a children's hospital to acquire the land for a luxury development. He'd threatened the families of journalists who tried to investigate him. He'd even arranged accidents for employees who showed too much interest in his accounting practices. Detective Whitman sat in the gallery, his face ashen as years of corruption were laid bare. When Claire played a recording of him accepting bribes and discussing witness intimidation, he stood abruptly and left the courtroom. Judge Carter noted his departure with interest. During a brief recess, Elena Cruz discovered a hidden ledger in Caldwell's corporate office, documenting years of payoffs to police officials. But before she could secure it, a mysterious fire broke out in the records room. The sprinkler system activated just in time to save most of the documents, but the ledger was badly damaged. "This is getting dangerous," Elena told Judge Carter in his chambers. "First the break-in at Margaret Wilson's house, now this fire. Caldwell's desperate." Carter nodded gravely. "Double security on all evidence. And Ms. Cruz? Be careful. Men like Caldwell are most dangerous when they're cornered." Back in court, Victoria Holt launched a desperate counterattack, questioning the authenticity of Claire's recordings. She brought in audio experts who suggested the files might have been altered, though they couldn't prove it. "Your Honor," Victoria argued, "these recordings could easily have been manipulated by someone with a grudge against my client. Ms. Caldwell's own testimony reveals her bias against her brother." "Objection!" Elena stood. "The defense is attempting to discredit evidence they know is authentic. We have chain of custody documentation for every recording." "Sustained," Carter ruled. "Ms. Holt, unless you have concrete evidence of tampering, move on." Outside the courthouse, public pressure was mounting. Protesters gathered daily, demanding justice and police reform. News outlets ran constant coverage of the trial, with commentators dissecting every revelation. Some of Caldwell's former associates began distancing themselves, sensing which way the wind was blowing. The afternoon brought another shock when Officer Michael Sullivan took the stand. The young officer detailed years of witnessing corruption within the department, including specific instances of evidence tampering in Caldwell-related cases. Detective Whitman had a system, Sullivan testified. Certain evidence would be marked for special handling. That meant it would disappear or be altered before trial. Everyone knew what was happening, but nobody dared speak up. As Sullivan testified, Elena noticed one of the jurors looking increasingly uncomfortable. The juror passed a note to the bailiff, requesting to speak with Judge Carter in chambers. Carter called both attorneys to join them. The juror, a middle-aged teacher named Sarah Bennett, was trembling. "Someone left photos of my children in my mailbox," she revealed. Their school schedules were attached. The message said to make the right decision, or Carter immediately ordered additional security for all jurors and their families. The fact that Caldwell would dare tamper with the jury showed his desperation and his continued belief that he could control the system. That evening, Detective Whitman made a decision. He walked into the FBI field office and asked to speak with agents about Alexander Caldwell. After years of serving as Caldwell's fixer, he'd finally realized he was just another pawn in the billionaire's game. The next morning, Victoria Holt arrived in court without her client. "Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell is indisposed," she explained carefully. "Indisposed?" Carter's voice carried a dangerous edge. "This is a federal trial, Ms. Holt, not a social engagement. Where is your client?" Before she could answer, FBI agents entered the courtroom. "Mr. Caldwell was apprehended attempting to board a private jet to a non-extradition country," the lead agent announced. "He's being brought here now." When Caldwell finally arrived, surrounded by agents, his transformation was complete. Gone was the polished businessman who'd strutted into court weeks ago. In his place sat a man undone by his own hubris, his expensive suit wrinkled, his silver hair unkempt. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Carter addressed him, "would you like to explain why you attempted to flee jurisdiction?" Caldwell's response dripped with venom. "This whole trial is a farce. My own sister, my flesh and blood conspiring with this judge who thinks he can take down someone like me?" "Someone like you?" Carter repeated quietly. "And what exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Caldwell?" The gallery held its breath, wondering if Caldwell would finally say the quiet part loud. Instead, he turned to his sister with a look of pure hatred. "You were always jealous," he spat. "Always the good daughter, the moral one. Well, look where morality got our father. Dead and forgotten. I built something real. I made our name. Means something." "Our name?" Claire's voice trembled with emotion. "You made our name synonymous with corruption and cruelty. Dad died because you destroyed him, Alexander. I'm doing this because someone has to stop you before you hurt anyone else." The day's final blow came when Detective Whitman's FBI interview was entered into evidence. He detailed years of corruption, naming names and providing dates. The web of criminality centered on Caldwell, but extended throughout the city's power structure. Elena Cruz's closing argument was passionate but measured. She methodically laid out the evidence, not just of financial crimes, but of a systematic assault on justice itself. Caldwell hadn't just broken laws, he'd tried to break the entire system that upheld them. Victoria Holt's closing felt hollow. In comparison, she spoke of reasonable doubt and circumstantial evidence, but her heart wasn't in it. She'd seen the same recordings as everyone else, heard her client's own words reveal his true nature. As the jury retired to deliberate, Judge Carter watched Caldwell being led back to custody. The businessman's earlier swagger had vanished, replaced by the wary movements of a man who finally realized he wasn't in control. In his chambers that evening, Carter reflected on the trial's strange journey. What had begun as a case of financial crimes had exposed something far darker, a cancer of corruption that had nearly consumed the city's justice system. Elena Cruz knocked on his door, carrying fresh coffee and a tired smile. "The jury's been out for 3 hours," she reported. "But after everything they've seen and heard," Carter nodded. Both of them knew that in this case, justice wasn't just about one man's guilt or innocence. It was about proving that the system itself could still work, that truth could still prevail over power and money. Outside his window, the protesters remained, their candles twinkling in the gathering dusk. Their signs called for justice, for reform, for change. Thanks to Claire's courage and the dedication of people like Elena Cruz and Officer Sullivan, they might actually see it. The next morning would bring the verdict, But the real victory had already been won. Caldwell's true nature had been exposed, his network of corruption revealed. Whatever the jury decided, nothing would ever be quite the same. The morning news hit like a thunderbolt. Every major network ran the story. Judge Carter accused of racial bias and misconduct. Detective Whitman had orchestrated a masterful smear campaign, leaking carefully edited court transcripts and out-of-context quotes that painted Carter as a judge with a personal vendetta against successful white defendants. Judge Carter watched the coverage from his office, his expression unchanged. The headline scrolling across the screen read, "Sources question Judge Carter's fitness to preside over high-profile Caldwell case." "They're desperate," Elena Cruz said, standing in his doorway. "This is what Caldwell does when he's losing. He attacks the integrity of the whole system." Before Carter could respond, his phone buzzed. The text message was simple. "Your grandson. Tommy enjoys his little league games. It would be a shame if something happened during practice today." Attached was a photo of Tommy in his baseball uniform, clearly taken that morning. Carter's hands tightened around the phone. In 20 years on the bench, no one had dared threaten his family. He immediately called his daughter Sharon, telling her to pick Tommy up from school and take him to a secure location. Then he contacted the FBI. Meanwhile, across town, Claire Caldwell worked with federal agents in a secure room, methodically going through decades of financial records. Her second ledger, hidden away years ago, contained details of payments to law enforcement officers that made the first one look tame in comparison. "Look at this," she pointed to an entry. $500,000 to Chief Inspector Williams, dated the day before he suddenly dropped the investigation into that suspicious fire at the children's hospital site. Elena Cruz leaned in, studying the numbers. "And these regular payments to Judge Reynolds. Isn't he the one who dismissed 3 separate lawsuits against Caldwell Enterprises last year?" "Alexander didn't just buy individual officers," Claire explained. "He bought entire departments, judges, regulatory officials, anyone who could potentially stand in his way." Back in the courthouse, Victoria Holt filed an emergency motion to disqualify Judge Carter from the case, citing the morning's news stories as evidence of bias. Carter listened to her arguments with the same patient attention he'd shown throughout the trial. "Ms. Holt," he said when she finished, "your motion is denied. These accusations are clearly a response to yesterday's revelations. This court will not be intimidated by character assassination attempts." Victoria's practiced composure slipped slightly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, public confidence in your impartiality has been compromised. The appearance of bias alone is manufactured," Carter cut in. "Just like the evidence that keeps disappearing from police custody. Just like the sudden problems your client's opponents always seem to encounter. The motion is denied." As Victoria returned to her seat, a commotion erupted in the gallery. One of the jurors, Michael Pierce, had collapsed, clutching his chest. The court medical officer rushed to his aid, but it was clear something was seriously wrong. Hours later, toxicology reports revealed Pierce had been poisoned, a clear message to the other jurors. Carter immediately ordered the entire jury sequestered under federal protection, but the damage to their sense of security was done. That evening, Judge Carter sat in his study at home, reviewing case law on jury intimidation. A shadow moved across his window. He reached for his phone, but before he could call security, a brick crashed through the glass, missing his head by inches. Attached was a note. "Even federal judges bleed." The next morning, Elena Cruz arrived at the courthouse early, determined to press their advantage despite the escalating threats. She found her office door ajar, papers scattered across the floor. Someone had broken in during the night, but in their haste to find something incriminating, they'd left behind a crucial piece of evidence, a single police-issue glove. "They're getting sloppy," Elena told Carter, displaying the glove in an evidence bag. "Desperation makes people careless." Carter nodded, but his mind was on the mounting pressure on his family. His wife Michelle had noticed cars following her to work. His daughter Sharon reported strangers photographing Tommy's school. Even his elderly mother had received suspicious visits from police officers asking questions about her son. During the morning session, Claire took the stand again, this time revealing the full scope of her brother's retaliation against witnesses. She described how Caldwell's network of corrupt officers would manufacture evidence, plant drugs, or create false arrest records for anyone who dared to speak against him. It wasn't just intimidation, Claire testified. Alexander believed in destroying people completely. He'd take their jobs, their reputations, their freedom, anything to maintain his power. Victoria Holt's cross-examination turned vicious. Isn't it true, Ms. Caldwell, that you were passed over to lead Caldwell Enterprises? That your brother's success has always eaten away at you? Success? Claire's voice cracked with emotion. Is that what you call it when he drove our father to suicide? When he bankrupted families and destroyed lives? When he had people attacked or killed because they threatened his empire? The gallery gasped at this last revelation. Victoria quickly tried to move to strike, but the words hung in the air like smoke. During the lunch recess, one of the remaining jurors, Patricia Williams, requested to speak with Judge Carter. In chambers, with both attorneys present, she revealed that someone had approached her teenage daughter, offering a full college scholarship in exchange for a not guilty vote. I want to do the right thing, Patricia said, tears in her eyes. But my daughter's future. Carter leaned forward. Ms. Williams, I want you to listen carefully. What they're offering isn't a scholarship. It's a bribe. Your daughter's future will be better served by seeing her mother stand up to corruption than by accepting blood money. Patricia straightened in her chair, nodding firmly. The attempt to bribe her had backfired, strengthening her resolve instead of weakening it. The afternoon brought a breakthrough that changed everything. Elena Cruz discovered a pattern in the offshore accounts that proved Caldwell had been laundering money for years through a network of seemingly legitimate charities. The money trail led straight to high-ranking political figures who had consistently blocked investigations into Caldwell Enterprises. But just as Elena prepared to present this evidence, a suspicious fire broke out in the records room of her office building. The sprinkler system activated quickly, but not before several key documents were damaged. It was the latest in a series of convenient accidents that had plagued the prosecution. Detective Whitman, growing increasingly desperate, made his final play. He leaked documents to the press suggesting Judge Carter had accepted bribes early in his career. The story was completely fabricated, but several news outlets ran with it before verifying the sources. Carter watched the story spread across social media, knowing that even when proven false, the accusations would leave a lasting stain. It was a calculated move. If they couldn't beat him legally, they'd destroy his reputation. The judge's response came not in words, but in action. He signed orders allowing federal agents to seize records from the police department's evidence room, effectively removing Whitman's ability to manipulate evidence. He also authorized a special task force to investigate the pattern of witness intimidation. That night, as Carter worked late in his chambers, he received an unexpected visit from Officer Sullivan. The young policeman looked nervous but determined. "Judge, there's something you need to know," Sullivan began. "Detective Whitman, he's planning something big. I overheard him on the phone with someone, talking about making sure you get the message once and for all." Carter studied the young officer. "Are you willing to testify to this?" "Yes, sir. I joined the force to protect people, not to help criminals escape justice. Whatever happens, I'm done being part of this corruption." As Sullivan left, Carter reflected on how this case had evolved. What had started as a financial crimes trial had exposed a vast network of corruption that reached into every corner of the city's power structure. The real question wasn't whether Caldwell was guilty, it was how many others would fall with him. Elena Cruz arrived early the next morning, her face tense with new concerns. "Your Honor, we have a problem. The janitor who tried to testify, David Martinez, he's disappeared. His family says he never came home last night." Carter immediately contacted the FBI, but everyone knew what this meant. Caldwell's people were eliminating loose ends, silencing potential witnesses before they could expose the full extent of the corruption. In court, Victoria Holt seemed increasingly uncomfortable with her role in the proceedings. The evidence of her client's crimes had become too overwhelming to ignore, and the tactics being used to obstruct justice were growing more violent. During a heated exchange about missing evidence, Victoria faltered in her defense. "Your Honor, while my client maintains his innocence, I must express concern about certain actions taken by parties unknown." Caldwell shot her a warning look, but Victoria continued. "The integrity of the legal process must be preserved, regardless of—" "Ms. Holt," Caldwell cut in sharply, "I need to speak with you. Now." During their whispered conference, Carter observed the dynamic between them. Victoria's body language showed increasing resistance to her client's demands, while Caldwell's barely contained rage was visible in his clenched jaw and trembling hands. The afternoon brought another anonymous threat to Carter's family, this one accompanied by detailed information about his wife's daily routine. The message was clear: back off, or those you love will pay the price. But Carter had spent his life fighting against intimidation and injustice. Each threat only strengthened his resolve to see this case through to the end, to ensure that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, could consider themselves above the law. As day turned to evening, Carter received word that David Martinez had been found, scared but alive. The would-be kidnappers had fled when federal agents appeared, leaving behind evidence that would further implicate Detective Whitman and his corrupt officers. In his chambers that night, Carter reviewed the day's events with Elena Cruz. The mounting threats, the attempted witness tampering, the desperate smear campaigns, all pointed to a corruption network beginning to implode. "They're getting reckless," Elena observed, "making mistakes. The question is, how many more people will they hurt before this is over?" Carter's response was interrupted by his clerk, Sarah, rushing in with breaking news. Detective Whitman had been caught on camera accepting a briefcase full of cash from one of Caldwell's associates. The footage was already spreading across social media. "The house of cards is falling," Carter mused. "But cornered animals are the most dangerous. Tomorrow will be crucial." As he prepared to leave for the night, Carter found one final note on his desk. Unlike the others, this one offered hope. "Not all cops are corrupt. Some of us remember our oath. Keep pushing. The truth is coming out." The judge smiled slightly, gathering his papers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new attempts to derail justice. But the momentum had shifted. The corruption that had seemed untouchable was beginning to crumble, exposed to the light of truth. In his car, driving home through the darkened city streets, Carter thought about all the people who had risked everything to stand up to Caldwell's corruption. Claire with her carefully gathered evidence, Elena with her relentless pursuit of justice, Officer Sullivan with his brave testimony, and countless others who had refused to be silenced. The truth was emerging, piece by piece, and no amount of threats or intimidation could stop it now. The only question was how many more secrets would be revealed before the full extent of the corruption was finally exposed. The courthouse buzzed with nervous energy as David Martinez was escorted into Judge Carter's chambers by federal agents. The janitor's clothes were wrinkled, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determination. After 3 days of being held captive in an abandoned warehouse, he was ready to tell his story. Elena Cruz sat beside him, recorder in hand, as he described his ordeal. They wore masks, but I recognized Detective Whitman's voice. They kept asking what evidence I had, what I planned to testify about. When I wouldn't talk, His hand trembled as he touched the bruises on his face. Judge Carter leaned forward. "Mr. Martinez, no one would blame you for walking away after what you've endured. Are you certain you want to testify?" "My father was a janitor too," Martinez replied, straightening in his chair. "He taught me that a man's integrity is worth more than his life. I watched Mr. Caldwell destroy people for years. Someone needs to speak the truth." When Martinez took the stand an hour later, the courtroom fell silent. He testified about years of overheard conversations and discovered documents, painting a picture of corruption that extended far beyond financial crimes. He described how Caldwell would hold court in his office late at night, meeting with police officials, judges, and politicians who came to receive their bribes and instructions. The night before the children's hospital mysteriously burned down, Martinez revealed, "I was cleaning near Mr. Caldwell's office. I heard him on the phone, laughing about how much money he'd make from the insurance payout and the land development. He said, 'Sometimes progress requires sacrifice.'" Victoria Holt's cross-examination was half-hearted at best. The security footage of her client celebrating the hospital fire had already been entered into evidence through Claire's testimony. Each question she asked only seemed to strengthen Martinez's credibility. During the lunch recess, Detective Whitman made a fatal mistake. Panicked by Martinez's testimony, he tried to break into the federal evidence lockup where Claire's recordings were stored. The FBI agents who arrested him found a thumb drive containing falsified evidence meant to discredit Judge Carter, along with a list of witnesses marked for special handling. The afternoon session brought another bombshell as Margaret Wilson returned to the stand. The former accountant had spent weeks rebuilding her documentation of Caldwell's financial crimes, working from copies she'd wisely stored in multiple locations. It wasn't just money laundering, she testified, projecting spreadsheets onto the courtroom screen. Mr. Caldwell created a complex network of shell companies to hide his illegal activities. Each company served a specific purpose: bribing officials, funding criminal operations, or hiding stolen assets. As Margaret detailed the flow of money, Caldwell's composed facade cracked further. He whispered furiously to Victoria Holt, who shook her head in response. Their disagreement became heated enough that Judge Carter had to call for order. "Ms. Holt," Carter addressed the defense attorney, "do you need a moment with your client?" "No." "Your Honor," Victoria replied, moving slightly away from Caldwell. "My client and I appear to have a fundamental disagreement about trial strategy." The implications of her statement hung in the air. Victoria Holt, known for defending wealthy clients regardless of their guilt, seemed to be distancing herself from Caldwell's increasingly desperate tactics. Elena Cruz seized the moment to introduce new evidence, a series of offshore bank statements showing millions in payments to various shell companies. Each company's creation coincided with a major criminal operation: the hospital fire, the reporter's attack, the evidence tampering. "The money tells the story," Elena explained to the jury. "Every time Mr. Caldwell needed something illegal done, a new shell company would appear. The funds would flow through multiple accounts to hide their origin, but they always led back to Caldwell Enterprises." During her presentation, a commotion erupted in the gallery. Federal agents were arresting Judge Malcolm Reynolds, one of the judges Caldwell had repeatedly bribed to dismiss cases against him. Reynolds had made the mistake of trying to contact a juror's family member. Caldwell watched the arrest with growing agitation. His usual smirk had been replaced by a nervous tick in his jaw. The sight of his allies being taken down one by one was clearly unnerving him. Claire Caldwell took the stand again, this time armed with years of surveillance footage from the family estate. "Alexander installed cameras everywhere," she explained. "He was paranoid about his own security, but he never thought I might access the footage." The videos showed a parade of corrupt officials entering and leaving Caldwell's study. Each one left carrying an envelope or briefcase. Some footage showed Caldwell explicitly discussing illegal operations, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, even plans for the hospital fire. "This footage," Claire continued, her voice steady, "shows my brother for who he really is. Not a successful businessman, but a criminal who built his empire on corruption and human suffering." Caldwell finally exploded. "You treacherous bitch," he shouted, rising from his seat. "I gave you everything. A life of luxury, the best education, connections to power. This is how you repay me?" "You gave me nothing but shame," Claire replied, calmly. "Every luxury was paid for with someone else's pain. Every connection was built on corruption. I'm doing this because someone has to stop you." Judge Carter's gavel cracked through the air. "Mr. Caldwell, control yourself or you'll be removed from this courtroom. Ms. Caldwell, please continue," The afternoon brought a series of rapid developments. The FBI arrested 3 more police officers connected to witness intimidation. An anonymous source leaked emails showing Caldwell's direct involvement in jury tampering attempts. Victoria. Holt was seen entering the federal building, presumably to discuss a potential plea deal. Elena Cruz stepped up to display more evidence on the courtroom screens. These documents show how Mr. Caldwell systematically corrupted our city's institutions. Every department, every agency that should have stopped him was compromised. He didn't just break the law. He tried to break the entire system of justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed millions flowing to corrupt officials. Surveillance footage captured countless illegal meetings. Witness testimony painted a picture of absolute corruption and casual cruelty. Your Honor, Victoria Holt suddenly interrupted, standing. May I approach the bench? In a whispered conference with Carter and Elena Cruz, Victoria made a stunning revelation. My client attempted to bribe me this morning to fabricate evidence against Judge Carter. I have recordings of the conversation. Caldwell, watching the discussion, seemed to deflate in his chair. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and even his own attorney had turned against him. The next witness was a surprise to everyone. Thomas Bradford, the whistleblower who had earlier been intimidated into silence, returned to testify. Federal protection had given him the courage to speak out. Mr. Caldwell didn't just steal money, Bradford testified. He stole people's futures, pension funds emptied, retirement savings wiped out, entire communities devastated. And he laughed about it. He called his victims necessary casualties of progress. As Bradford spoke, Elena Cruz noticed one of the jurors wiping away tears. The human cost of Caldwell's crimes was finally becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom. The day's final revelation came from an unexpected source. A young officer from the evidence room came forward with security footage showing Detective Whitman removing and destroying evidence. The officer had kept a secret copy, waiting for the right moment to expose the corruption. I couldn't stay silent anymore, the officer testified. Seeing Mr. Martinez stand up to them gave me courage. We're supposed to protect people, not help criminals escape justice. Judge Carter ended the day's session with a clear sense that justice was finally prevailing. The web of corruption Caldwell had spent decades building was unraveling thread by thread. In his chambers that evening, Carter reviewed the day's developments with Elena Cruz. Caldwell's empire was built on intimidation and fear, he observed. Once people found the courage to speak out, it began to collapse. Elena nodded, sorting through the mountain of evidence on his desk. It's like a dam breaking. Each new revelation encourages more people to come forward. The question is, how many more surprises are we in for? The answer came sooner than expected. Late that night, Victoria Holt contacted the FBI with information about a hidden vault in Caldwell's mansion. Inside, agents found decades of blackmail material, photos, videos, and documents that Caldwell had used to control his network of corrupt officials. The next morning, the courthouse was surrounded by news vans and protesters. The public had finally seen Caldwell's true nature, and they were demanding justice. Signs reading, "No one is above the law and end corruption," filled the streets. Inside the courtroom, Caldwell's transformation was complete. Gone was the arrogant businessman who had refused to stand for Judge Carter. In his place sat a desperate man watching his life's work dissolve into nothing. Elena Cruz's presentation continued, methodically laying out years of criminal activity, each piece of evidence connected to others, building an unshakable picture of corruption and cruelty. The prosecution would like to play one final recording, Elena announced. This was recovered from Mr. Caldwell's private vault last night. The recording captured Caldwell in his office, openly discussing his contempt for the law. Justice is just another commodity. His voice rang through the courtroom. Everything has a price. Every man can be bought. The trick is finding their weakness and exploiting it. Victoria Holt rose slowly. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, I request a brief recess to discuss options with my client. Judge Carter studied the defense attorney's face, understanding the implications. Granted. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. As federal agents led Caldwell from the courtroom, he turned to his sister one last time. "You think this is justice?" he sneered. "You've destroyed our family's legacy." "No, Alexander," Claire replied softly. "You did that yourself. I'm just making sure the truth comes out." The truth was indeed coming out, in ways no one had anticipated. Each hour brought new revelations as more people found the courage to speak up. Caldwell's empire of corruption was collapsing like a house of cards in a strong wind. Judge Carter watched it all from his bench, maintaining his judicial composure while inwardly celebrating each victory for justice. The system wasn't perfect, but today it was working exactly as it should. As the sun set over the courthouse, casting long shadows through the high windows, Carter knew that tomorrow would bring the final act in this drama. Caldwell's fate would soon be decided, but his downfall had already accomplished something remarkable. It had shown that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, was truly above the law. A heavy silence fell over courtroom 237 as the jury filed in. After 6 hours of deliberation, they had reached their verdict. Judge Carter studied their faces. Some showed relief, others determination, but all carried the weight of what they were about to do. Alexander Caldwell sat at the defense table, his expensive suit now wrinkled, his silver hair unkempt. Despite his disheveled appearance, arrogance still radiated from his rigid posture. Beside him, Victoria Holt maintained a professional distance, having failed to convince her client to accept the prosecution's last-minute plea offer. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Carter asked, his deep voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. The foreperson, Patricia Williams, the same juror who had rejected Caldwell's attempt to buy her vote with a college scholarship, stood. "We have, Your Honor." Elena Cruz gripped the edge of the prosecution table, her knuckles white. Months of work, countless threats, and numerous obstacles had led to this moment. Beside her, Claire Caldwell sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on her brother. "On the count of tax fraud in the first degree, how do you find?" "Guilty." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "On the count of embezzlement?" "Guilty." "Money laundering?" "Guilty." As the litany of guilty verdicts continued, Caldwell's facade finally cracked, his face contorted with rage as he realized the full extent of his defeat. 27 counts, 27 guilty verdicts. His empire of corruption was officially in ruins. "You can't do this to me," Caldwell snarled, rising from his chair. "I own this city. I've bought better judges than you, Carter. This isn't over." "Remove the defendant," Carter ordered, his voice cutting through Caldwell's tirade. As federal marshals moved to handcuff him, Caldwell lunged toward his sister. "You treacherous bitch. You think this makes you righteous? You're nothing but a jealous—" The marshals restrained him before he could reach Claire, who hadn't flinched. She watched with sad eyes as her brother was dragged from the courtroom, still shouting threats and obscenities. Outside the courthouse, the news spread quickly. Crowds of protesters erupted in cheers. Many were victims of Caldwell's schemes, retired teachers whose pensions he'd stolen, families who'd lost homes to his fraudulent development projects, former employees he'd ruined. Back inside, Judge Carter addressed the remaining courtroom. "The defendant will be remanded to federal custody pending sentencing. I want to thank the jury for their service and courage in the face of unprecedented intimidation attempts." As the jury filed out under federal protection, Elena Cruz began gathering her materials. The victory felt surreal after weeks of threats, evidence tampering, and corruption. She caught Judge Carter's eye and saw her own relief mirrored there. The fallout came swiftly. Within hours of the verdict, federal agents launched coordinated raids across the city. Detective Whitman was arrested at his home, where agents discovered millions in cash and incriminating documents. Judge Reynolds was taken into custody while attempting to flee the country. By evening, the police department was in chaos. Officers loyal to Whitman were being suspended or arrested, while honest cops who had been silenced for years finally felt free to speak up. The commissioner called an emergency press conference to announce a complete internal investigation. Claire Caldwell watched the news coverage from Judge Carter's chambers, where federal agents were taking her statement about years of corruption she had witnessed. "There's something you should know," she told Elena Cruz. "Alexander made one last call before the verdict. I couldn't hear what he said, but he was smiling afterward." Elena's concern proved justified. That night, as Judge Carter left the courthouse, shots rang out in the parking garage. The judge dropped to the ground as his security detail returned fire. The would-be assassin, a former police officer on Caldwell's payroll, was wounded and captured. The attack only strengthened the resolve of those fighting corruption. The next morning, honest officers within the department began coming forward in droves, sharing evidence they'd hidden away out of fear of retaliation. Each new revelation expanded the investigation's scope. "Your Honor," Elena said during an emergency meeting in Carter's chambers, "we've uncovered evidence of judicial corruption in at least 15 other states. Caldwell's network went far beyond this city." Carter nodded grimly. "Contact the federal task force. This is bigger than any of us realized." As federal agents swarmed through Caldwell Enterprises' offices, they discovered the true extent of his criminal empire. Hidden servers revealed decades of blackmail material, proving corruption at every level of government. The company's legitimate businesses had been a front for a massive criminal organization. Victoria Holt, seeing the writing on the wall, began cooperating with prosecutors. She provided details about other wealthy clients who had used similar tactics to subvert justice. Her testimony would eventually lead to dozens more investigations. In his holding cell, Caldwell received news of each fresh betrayal with growing fury. His attempts to contact allies were blocked. Most wouldn't take his calls anyway. Those who had once feared him now scrambled to save themselves by providing evidence against him. The media coverage was relentless. News channels ran constant updates about arrests and revelations. Journalists who had once been too afraid to investigate Caldwell now published exposés about his crimes. The public's hunger for justice seemed insatiable. 1 week after the verdict, Judge Carter sat in his chambers reviewing sentencing guidelines when his clerk brought in a letter. It was from Tommy, his grandson. "Dear Grandpa, Mom says you're a hero because you weren't scared of the bad man. I want to be brave like you when I grow up." Carter smiled, tucking the letter into his robe pocket. The threats to his family had been terrifying, but moments like this made the risk worthwhile. The city was changing. With Caldwell's network exposed, corrupt officials were being removed from power. Regular citizens felt emboldened to report wrongdoing, knowing they would finally be heard. A culture of accountability was slowly replacing one of fear and silence. Elena Cruz's office became a hub for whistleblowers and witnesses. People brought evidence of other corruption schemes, leading to new investigations. The dam had broken, and decades of suppressed truth were flooding out. Claire Caldwell established a foundation to help victims of corporate fraud, using her share of the family fortune to provide restitution that courts couldn't mandate. The first beneficiaries were the families affected by the Children's Hospital fire. Detective Whitman, facing decades in prison, finally broke his silence. His detailed confession implicated dozens of other officers and officials, describing how Caldwell had systematically corrupted the department through a combination of bribes and blackmail. "He started small," Whitman testified. "Little favors, small payments. By the time you realized how deep you were, it was too late to get out. He owned you." The honest officers who had resisted corruption were finally vindicated. Michael Sullivan, the young officer who had first warned Judge Carter about evidence tampering, was promoted to lead a new internal affairs unit dedicated to preventing future corruption. As the sentencing date approached, pressure mounted on Judge Carter. Caldwell's remaining allies launched a desperate media campaign questioning the judge's impartiality. Anonymous threats continued to arrive at his office and home, but Carter remained unmoved. He had spent his career fighting for justice, and this case represented everything he believed in. The system could work if people had the courage to stand up for what was right. The day before sentencing, Margaret Wilson visited Carter's chambers. The former accountant whose testimony had helped expose Caldwell's financial crimes wanted to share something. We found more evidence in the backup servers, she explained. Mr. Caldwell didn't just steal money. He deliberately targeted vulnerable communities. He called it social engineering, forcing people out of neighborhoods. He wanted to develop by destroying their economic foundations. Carter added this information to his sentencing considerations. The human cost of Caldwell's crimes went far beyond dollars and cents. He had systematically attacked society's most vulnerable members, seeing them as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be protected. That evening, Elena Cruz prepared her sentencing recommendation. The prosecution would seek maximum penalties on all counts, arguing that Caldwell's crimes represented an unprecedented attack on the justice system itself. Throughout the city, citizens gathered for candlelight vigils. They shared stories of how Caldwell's crimes had affected their lives, finding solidarity in their common struggle for justice. The case had become a symbol of hope, proof that even the most powerful could be held accountable. In his cell, Caldwell made one final attempt to regain control. He offered prosecutors evidence against even bigger targets in exchange for leniency. But his bargaining power was gone. The investigation he had sparked would continue with or without his cooperation. The morning of sentencing brought crowds to the courthouse steps. Signs demanded justice, but there was no anger in the demonstration, only quiet determination to see the process through. Inside, Carter prepared to deliver the most significant sentence of his career. He reviewed his notes one final time, thinking about all the lives Caldwell had damaged or destroyed. Justice demanded more than punishment. It required a clear message that no one was above the law. Claire sat in the gallery as her brother was led in, shackled and wearing prison orange instead of his customary tailored suits. Their eyes met briefly, decades of family history passing between them in a single glance. Elena Cruz sat at the prosecution table, her posture straight but relaxed. She had fought hard for this moment, risking her career and her safety to expose the truth. Now justice would finally be served. Victoria Holt's seat at the defense table was occupied by a public defender. She had withdrawn from the case after providing evidence about Caldwell's attempt to fabricate evidence against Judge Carter. The gallery was packed with reporters, victims, and citizens who had followed the case. Every eye was fixed on Judge Carter as he prepared to announce the sentence that would end Alexander Caldwell's reign of corruption. Caldwell stood before the bench, his arrogance finally replaced by the uncertainty of a man facing consequences for the first time in his life. The moment of justice had arrived, and not all his money and power could stop it. 6 months after Alexander Caldwell's conviction, Judge Anthony Carter stood at his chamber window, watching the morning sun illuminate a changed city. The ripples from the trial had spread far beyond their jurisdiction, sparking a nationwide movement for judicial reform and anti-corruption measures. His quiet reflection was interrupted by Elena Cruz, arriving with fresh coffee and a stack of newspapers. "You've seen the headlines?" she asked, spreading them across his desk. Each one detailed new investigations spawned by the Caldwell case. Federal task force uncovers corruption in 12 more states. Carter read aloud. Supreme Court to review anti-corruption guidelines. They're calling it the Caldwell effect, how one case exposed the cracks in the entire system. Elena nodded, sipping her coffee. The nomination committee is meeting today. Word is you're their top choice for the federal bench. Carter had been approached about the nomination weeks ago, but his mind was on more immediate concerns. In an hour, he would deliver Caldwell's final sentence. The disgraced businessman's empire had been dismantled, his assets frozen, his network of corruption exposed to daylight. The courthouse was packed as Carter took the bench. Caldwell sat at the defense table, thinner now after months in custody, but still radiating defiance. His new public defender, the fourth since Victoria Holt's departure, looked nervous. "Before we proceed with sentencing," Carter began, "Mr. Caldwell, you have the right to address this court. Do you wish to make a statement?" Caldwell stood slowly, his shackles clinking in the hushed courtroom. "You think this is justice?" he sneered. "You've destroyed something you don't even understand. I brought progress to this city. I made things happen while bureaucrats talked. Yes, I broke your precious rules, Because rules are for people who lack the vision to change the world. Carter let him finish, noting how even Caldwell's defiance had diminished. The man who had once commanded a criminal empire now ranted like a petty tyrant, his words echoing hollowly in the courtroom. "Mr. Caldwell," Carter responded, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "Progress without justice is merely tyranny dressed in finer clothes. You speak of vision, but your only vision was of personal power and profit. You didn't serve this city. You parasitized it." The judge lifted a document, Caldwell's final sentencing report. "This court sentences you to 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Additionally, all assets derived from criminal activity will be seized and redistributed to your victims through a supervised restitution program." As federal marshals led Caldwell away, he turned to make one final threat. "This isn't over, Carter. I still have friends in high places. Those friends were already scrambling to save themselves." That same morning, federal agents arrested 3 state senators and a federal judge implicated in Caldwell's corruption network. The investigation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Claire Caldwell watched her brother's sentencing from the gallery, her face a mask of composed grief. Afterward, she met with Elena Cruz to discuss the Victim Restitution Foundation she'd established. "We've identified over 2,000 victims of Alexander's schemes," Claire explained, spreading documents across Elena's desk. "The foundation will ensure they're compensated, even beyond what the courts can mandate." Their meeting was interrupted by breaking news. Someone had tried to break into Judge Carter's home. The attempt had been thwarted by federal agents, who arrested 2 former police officers still loyal to Detective Whitman. "They never learn," Elena muttered, watching the news coverage. "Every attack just proves how much we needed this change." The changes were indeed sweeping. Michael Sullivan, now heading the police department's anti-corruption unit, had implemented strict new oversight protocols. Officers with connections to Caldwell were being systematically removed and replaced with carefully vetted recruits. David Martinez, the janitor whose testimony had helped expose Caldwell's crimes, had been hired as a compliance officer at Caldwell Enterprises, now under new management and renamed Phoenix Industries. His first act was to establish an anonymous whistleblower program. Margaret Wilson returned to her position as head accountant, this time with a mandate to create transparent financial systems. She worked closely with federal regulators to develop new protocols for detecting and preventing corporate fraud. The ripples spread beyond the city. Law schools began using the Caldwell case to teach about systemic corruption. Police academies incorporated lessons about maintaining integrity under pressure. Judge Carter was increasingly invited to speak about judicial independence and the importance of ethical courage. One afternoon, Elena found Carter in his chambers, reviewing applications for a new judicial mentorship program. "Looking for the next generation of incorruptible judges?" she asked. "Something like that," he smiled. "The Caldwell case showed us how fragile the system can be. We need people who understand that justice isn't just about following rules. It's about protecting the fundamental dignity of every person." Their conversation was interrupted by Carter's clerk bringing news about Detective Whitman. The former police chief had finally broken under pressure, offering evidence against corruption networks in other cities in exchange for consideration during sentencing. "It never ends," Elena sighed. "Each revelation leads to 10 more investigations." "Good," Carter replied firmly. "The truth should come out, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people in power." The truth was indeed emerging, in ways that transformed the city's power structure. Citizens who had once felt helpless against corruption now had channels to report it. Community oversight boards were established for major institutions. Transparency became more than a buzzword. Claire's Victim Restitution Foundation became a model for similar programs nationwide. She worked tirelessly to ensure that her brother's victims received not just compensation, but a chance to rebuild their lives. "It's not about the money," she told a group of former Caldwell Enterprises employees. "It's about restoring faith in the system, about showing that justice can work for everyone, not just the wealthy and powerful." The media's attention eventually began to shift to new stories. But the impact of the Caldwell case continued to resonate. Other judges cited Carter's decisions in similar cases. Police departments across the country studied the investigation as a model for rooting out corruption. Tommy, Carter's grandson, brought his entire class to tour the courthouse. "My grandpa showed that good guys can win," he proudly told his teacher. Carter, overhearing this, felt a renewed sense of purpose. The next generation needed to believe in justice. 1 year after the sentencing, Carter sat in his chambers late. One evening, reading letters from people impacted by the case. A mother whose daughter's college fund had been restored. A retired teacher who could finally access his pension. A journalist who felt empowered to investigate corruption without fear. Elena Cruz knocked on his door, carrying a familiar coffee cup. "The Federal Nomination Committee is meeting again tomorrow," she reminded him. "Are you ready to move up to the next level?" Carter gestured to the letters on his desk. "I've been thinking about that. The federal bench would be an honor, but there's still work to be done here. This city needs to know that what we achieved wasn't just about one case or one corrupt businessman. It was about changing the whole system," Elena finished. "Speaking of which, have you seen the latest numbers? Reports of corporate fraud are up 300% since the Caldwell case. Because people finally believe reporting it will make a difference." Carter nodded. "That's the real victory. Not just punishing one man's crimes, but restoring faith in justice itself." Their discussion was interrupted by breaking news. Federal agents had just arrested a prominent CEO in another state, using evidence that traced back to Caldwell's hidden records. The ripples continued to spread. Claire Caldwell's foundation announced its latest initiative, a program to support whistleblowers who exposed corporate corruption. She named it after David Martinez, honoring the janitor's courage in speaking truth to power. Alexander Caldwell, meanwhile, faced additional charges as new evidence emerged. His attempts to run his criminal network from prison had been detected and shut down. Former allies refused to take his calls, afraid of drawing attention from investigators. Judge Carter's reforms began showing measurable results. Conviction. Rates in corruption cases rose significantly. Public trust in the justice system improved. Young lawyers and judges sought mentorship from those who had stood firm during the Caldwell case. The city itself was healing. Communities devastated by Caldwell's schemes were rebuilding. The Children's Hospital was reconstructed, this time with strict oversight of all funds. Phoenix Industries, under new leadership, became a model of corporate responsibility. Michael, Sullivan's anti-corruption unit, became a template for other police departments. He regularly consulted with federal agencies, sharing lessons learned from the Caldwell investigation. Margaret Wilson developed financial tracking systems that made it harder to hide criminal proceeds. Her methods were adopted by regulatory agencies nationwide, creating a more robust defense against corporate fraud. Late one evening, Carter left his chambers to find Elena still at work, reviewing files from ongoing corruption investigations. "We've barely scratched the surface," she told him. "Each case leads to 3 more. It's like pulling threads from a sweater. The whole thing starts to unravel." "Then we keep pulling threads," Carter replied, "until the next generation inherits a system they can trust." As he drove home that night, Carter passed the renovated Children's Hospital. Its windows glowed warmly in the darkness, a symbol of renewal and hope. The Caldwell case had shown that justice wasn't just an ideal. It was a living force that required constant vigilance and courage to maintain. Tommy was waiting at home, eager to share what he'd learned in his civics class. "We talked about your case today, Grandpa, about how one person standing up for what's right can change everything." Carter hugged his grandson, thinking about the legacy they were building. The Caldwell case hadn't just ended one man's corruption. It had sparked a movement for genuine systemic change. The next morning, Carter took his usual seat on the bench. The courtroom looked the same, but everything had changed. Where once corruption had bred fear and silence, now there was a growing culture of accountability and truth. As he prepared to hear the day's cases, Carter reflected on how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. The fight for justice wasn't a single battle, but a constant commitment. The Caldwell case had shown them the way. Now it was up to everyone to follow that path. Judge Anthony Carter proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't money or influence. It's the simple, unshakable belief that justice matters. What would you risk to stand up for what's right? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice, courage, and the moments that change everything. Leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on corruption and those brave enough to fight it. And remember, sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest stands.